250 years ago, a large group of people approached 3 ships here in the British colony of Massachusetts.
They moved more like a military unit than a mob. Through the dark of a winter's night, hundreds of men marched stealthily through the wharves of Boston Harbor with purpose. There was treason afoot, or patriotism. It was December the 16th, 1773, and here in Boston, the men were about to strike the spark of revolution. What happened here that night was the culmination of a crisis that had spread across 3 continents, from Bengal to the banks of the Thames to Boston Harbor. This is the story of an event that shook an empire and helped forge the United States. This is Boston, one of the great natural harbors of North America. Safe anchorage in all weathers, access to the huge pine forests of New England, so perfect for shipbuilding, but also access to the huge cod fisheries of the North Atlantic, almost limitless supply of food. In the 18th century, this was the capital of one of Britain's North American colonies. The future looked bright, but on the ground, things weren't quite that simple.
There's a problem. Despite all this potential, the colony of Massachusetts and many of the other colonies here on the eastern seaboard are not making money. Yes, some people here are getting rich, but the British Crown isn't making any profit out of this brave new world. I'm starting my exploration ashore in Boston, in a key place for the exchange of ideas, both loyalist and revolutionary. It's a pub.
The roots of the Boston Tea Party can be traced back to another refreshing tipple, although one a little bit stronger than a nice cup of tea. Rum. Rum was made here in Massachusetts in enormous quantities, created from the sugar coming from the Caribbean, where it was grown by enslaved Africans on plantations. The problem with Massachusetts sugar is that much of it came from the French islands like Martinique and Guadeloupe. In 1733, the British government had passed the Molasses Act. It was a huge bit of protectionism designed to boost the fortunes of the British plantations in the Caribbean by slapping very high tariffs on sugar grown elsewhere. The trouble is, it didn't really boost the British plantations at all. It boosted smuggling. People from Massachusetts and New England would go down to the French Caribbean, buy up loads of cheap sugar and bring it here, landing it without paying any tariffs at all. Everyone was involved in the illicit trade, including governors and their sidekicks. It's just a reflection of the fact that the people here in Massachusetts, they weren't really that bothered with following British rules and regulations.
But while there were grumblings in the bars and on the streets, at first things were reasonably calm in the official heart of government in Boston, the State House, where I'm meeting Professor Bob Allison of Suffolk University.
What does the setup, the architecture of the building we're in now, tell us about how this colony was run, where power lay?
So this is the old State House, also called the Townhouse. It was built in 1713 to be the seat of the Massachusetts provincial government. I don't say the royal government because Massachusetts is a province. The Assembly chooses a council to advise the governor, and the governor is appointed by the Crown. And they try to make sure the interests of the empire and the interests of Massachusetts are aligning, and for most of this period, they are. There's no real conflict because he's from Britain, because we're all British. We love the empire.
But times and global power politics were changing. the British Empire was getting bigger and bigger, and that was making things very complicated.
The 1760s, Britain had a big problem, and strangely, it was a problem born out of enormous success. Britain had just fought and won pretty much the most successful war in its history, the 7 Years' War, from the mid-1750s to the early 1760s. British fleets and armies had won victories all over the world. Here in North America, where it's remembered as the French-Indian War, Brits and their American colonial allies had driven the French out of great swathes of what is now Canada and the American Midwest. Britain had a huge empire, but she also had enormous debts. It had been a very expensive enterprise. And that meant from the 1760s, Britain needed to work out how to run this empire, how to make it pay for itself, which meant that from that point on, the big decisions affecting a colony like Massachusetts here wouldn't be taken in Boston, they'd be taken in London. Politicians here in Westminster weren't just dealing with the complaints of Boston merchants and other malcontents, they were handling a whole host of problems, some of which were a lot closer to home. One in particular had sprung up in the financial heart of the British Empire. About a mile from here, the City of London. This is Leadenhall, and this was the site of the surprisingly small main building of a massive imperial cash cow, the East India Company. Now, its trading interests may have been way out in India and the Far East, but the big decisions were taken here in its global headquarters.
At its height in the 18th century, the East India Company accounted for around half of the world's trade.
The East India Company is long gone from here now, but it's still an important financial centre. Lots of operations like banks and insurance companies. But the 18th century East India Company was just on a different scale to these businesses. It was a mighty pillar of the British state. The company paid the British government hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, both on the taxes raised from its imports, things like tea, but also the lump sum required for its operating licence. The East India Company was responsible for around 10% of the British government's annual revenue.
Today, the site of the East India Company is taken up by the steel and glass of the Lloyd's Insurance Building. 250 years ago, people right here would be making decisions affecting the original World Wide Web of ships, traders, warehouses, cash, and credit.
The East India Company traded commodities like cotton, silk, spices, and tea. Great mounds of the stuff was brought in from China. All of it carried in ships to London here, the world's port, and then stored in these vast warehouses. It was brought up from the river by porters or in trolleys and carts, so that these alleys and lanes were humming with the produce of the world.
But the East India Company was also in a bit of a mess, like a vast startup that had got out of control. Hugely profitable in India, but with powerful rivals and chaotic venal management. To get to grips with this powerful multinational, I'm meeting East India Company expert, Dr. Ben Gilding.
There is obviously a huge and growing market for goods like tea, especially in Britain, but there's a huge smuggling market. And so the Dutch East India Company, the French East India Company, the Swedish East India Company, they're all sending back goods as well to Europe. And many of those are providing the goods for smugglers, especially in tea.
Some East India Company tea was sold in Britain, where it was taxed, but lots more was re-exported to Europe and the rest of the world, including across the Atlantic.
Over 3,000 miles away, Boston now found itself as one of the key gateways into a vast new British North American empire. But that empire needed troops, a standing army of 10,000 men to defend and control it, and all that cost money. Now, the idea of politicians in London was that at least some of that revenue should be raised here in North America. But an idea that sounded so simple to politicians in England was a little more controversial on the streets and in the taverns of New England.
One of the main causes of discontent was that the decisions about these taxes weren't being made in Boston. They were coming top down from London.
Britain now has a huge North American empire, and that requires some running. It requires troops stationed on the frontier. They need money.
They do need money. And then in 1765, the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act does affect everyone. Sugar Act really affects you directly if you're a sugar importer. And that means you're fairly well off. The Stamp Act affects everybody. If you buy a newspaper, newspapers have a 1 shilling tax, marriage licenses, college diplomas, dice and playing cards also. We're also taxing those vices, but also to become a lawyer, you need to pay £50 for the stamp on your legal certificate. So the Stamp Act actually targets publishers and lawyers, who are probably two groups you don't want to alienate right off the bat. But here, local propagandists make this into a much broader thing. Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor, reports his servants afraid to go out at night for fear of the Stamp Act, this mysterious thing that is going to tax everybody. And Andrew Oliver, Hutchinson's brother-in-law, is appointed to be one of the tax agents. And in August, rumor spreads through town, the stamps have arrived. They're at his warehouse. Several hundred guys go to the warehouse on the night of August 14th and tear it down. This is a 2-story brick building. The stamps aren't in there, but they destroy the warehouse. And then the next day they invite Mr. Oliver to come to their gathering place, a big tree in the south end of Boston. And hanging from the tree is an effigy of Mr. Oliver, noose around his neck, holding a sign, "Death to the stamp tax." And they ask him if he wants to keep his position as a tax collector, and he says, no, he's resigning.
The Stamp Act was a failure. Not a penny was raised. But the British government remained determined to show it was the ultimate authority in the American colonies. New taxes aimed at specific goods were on their way.
2 years later, Parliament chooses to tax again with the Townshend duties, named for Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, taxing lead, paint, glass, tea. And these are all things the colonies have to import. Now, Governor Francis Bernard knows what happened the last time there were taxes like this, so he says, I'm going to need military support, actually, to enforce this. So General Gage in New York sends 2 regiments of British troops to Boston to keep the peace.
To try and get Boston under control, the British government finally sent in the army in late 1768. But unsurprisingly, flooding these narrow streets with thousands of young, red-coated soldiers did not have the desired effect.
The arrival of the British Army in force was presented by people like the engraver, Paul Revere, almost as an occupation. Soldiers pouring ashore, and warships filling the harbour. Tensions rose, and by early 1770, there was frequent trouble on Boston's icy streets. Redcoats were picked on and beaten up by gangs of locals. British authority was being challenged.
It all reached a head on the 5th of March, right here in the heart of British power, just outside the State House. A British sentry was guarding the hated customs building. It stood right next door. He was abused by a young kid. It escalated. A big mob of Bostonians gathered. More redcoats rushed to the scene. They abused the British soldiers. They spat on them. They pushed them around. They provoked them.
What happened next became known as the Boston Massacre. Engraved by Paul Revere as a well-drilled assault on the people of Boston.
it didn't really happen like that in reality. Instead, scared young redcoats, a lad called Hugh Montgomery, discharged his musket into the crowd. A few of his fellow soldiers followed suit. There was no order to do so, but that ragged, disorganised volley killed 3 men instantly and left 2 mortally wounded. There was certainly no tyrannical master plan to mow down Americans in the streets. The fact remains that British redcoats had just killed unarmed Bostonians right here in front of the State House. The city went berserk. The Sons of Liberty had an incendiary moment, and they intended to make the most out of it.
Paul Revere was in no doubt that fault lay with the hated taxes and their enforcers. He renamed the Customs House Butcher's Hall and showed a gun firing from the building itself. Sam Adams railed that the massacre was the bitter fruit of arbitrary power, not under the control of civil authority. And there's a huge irony. News hadn't arrived yet in Boston, but on the very day of the massacre, in London, Britain had actually repealed the Townshend Acts. All except one, the tax on tea.
So the same day here, the British troops are firing into a crowd, precipitating this other crisis. Parliament is backing down or doing something you think would appeal to these folks.
But it was too late. The damage had been done. To calm matters, British troops were withdrawn to a nearby fort. But the Sons of Liberty were in the ascendant in Boston itself, and gaining support in the countryside, despite their secretive approach. Unintentionally, the Townshend Act's duty on tea had put this innocent drink at the heart of the crisis. At Boston's Tea Party Museum, you can still sample a mug of hot 18th century style colonial brew.
Everyone knows that the Americans love a good cup of tea. Well, they did in the 18th century anyway. Tea was growing in popularity in Boston at the time. It was exotic. It was from the far side of the world, grown and produced exclusively in China, and the Chinese kept the secrets of that production very close to their chest. The British hadn't yet learned how to steal it and transplant it in other parts of South Asia. And these were the 5 different types of Chinese tea that had been carried in those ships here to Boston Harbour. This was probably the most popular in Boston at the time. Boohee, this was a blend, said to be a little rougher for the working man and woman. Yeah, I mean, it's not too bad. I'd drink that. I think it would have tasted a lot better and been a lot better for you, thanks to the boiled water, than just drinking out of one of the public fountains in the city. Now, over here, if you wanted something a little bit more expensive for the discerning palate, you could have this, the Souchong classic black tea. Much smokier. Yeah. Much more taste to that. That would have been for the more discerning customers, as with this one over here, the young Hyson green tea. This would have been served in the finest salon in Boston. That's a nice cup of tea.
But whether they liked drinking tea or not, many people in Boston and beyond were incensed that it was taxed by the British government without any opportunity for them to have a say in the matter. But over in London, the rising tide of dissent in New England was not top of the list of Britain's imperial priorities. By late 1772, politicians struggling to hold the empire together were presented with a full-blown crisis. Not in Boston, but in Bengal. The East India Company had appallingly mismanaged a vast famine in their Indian heartland. It's estimated over 1 million Bengalis died.
The problem really with the mercantile corporation trying to run a government, their goal is profit, not actually the good of the people that they're trying to govern. So they're actually a terrible recipe for a government.
And on top of that, the company's London headquarters in Leadenhall was under huge financial pressure as it was saddled with massive debts owed to employees returning from service in India. In London, on October the 8th, 1772, the Prime Minister, Lord North, had a very unpleasant meeting. The chairman of the East India Company reported that the company was on the verge of bankruptcy.
There was someone else in London who knew how much trouble the East India Company was in, and he lived in this house here, just a stone's throw from Westminster. Benjamin Franklin.
Franklin was born in Boston. He was an extraordinary polymath, a scientist, writer, and political philosopher. He lived here as the colonial agent of the American colonies, a sort of unofficial ambassador.
Ben Franklin had friends in high places on both sides of the Atlantic, and he used his position to oil the cogs of diplomacy. People would rush into this house bringing information and gossip, and in turn he would send out letters with advice and ideas. And he knew all about the trouble at the East India Company.
From his rooms here on the first floor, Franklin sent the information he'd gathered over to the American colonies.
This is a wonderful letter that really shows just how connected Franklin was. It's written just a few weeks after Lord North, the Prime Minister, receives the terrible news that the East India Company is in big trouble. But in this letter, Franklin seems to know all the details. So he's obviously got informants feeding him all the juicy stuff, which he then in turn passes on to people in the Americas. In this case, Mr. Joseph Galloway, very senior politician there. He is the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly. And he tells Galloway that the company have accepted bills which they find themselves unable to pay, though they have the value of $2 million in tea and other India goods in their stores. Unfortunately for them, they're perishing under want of demand.
Their credit thus suffering and their stock falling, government will lose £400,000 per annum. Can an American forbear smiling at these blunders? The company's problems are literally piling up in their warehouses and are in danger of destabilising British interests across the world.
I suppose they're also too big to fail. If the East India Company collapses, there are very real consequences in India. The French might move back into Bengal and take over. Britain and its empire would be seen to losing out.
Exactly, that's the kind of attitude that the British government had towards the East India Company, but also towards the American colonies, towards the colonies in the Caribbean, that any loss of power on their part could potentially lead to, or would rather lead to, gain on the part of the French or the Spanish or the Dutch.
The East India Company is sort of running Britain's empire in Asia on its behalf. It is essential for Britain's economy, it's essential for Britain's government finances, and I bet there's quite a few East India Company shareholders sitting in Parliament as well who are going to lose all their money.
Absolutely. I mean, there's almost 25% of the House of Commons and the House of Lords at this time have shares in the East India Company.
There's no chance the British government is going to let this company collapse.
Absolutely not, no.
One solution for the company was to ask the British government for a massive injection of cash.
They're asking for a loan of £1.5 million from the British government, which is a huge sum of money at the time. Bearing in mind the entire revenues of the British state at this period are about £8 million. And so this is a huge sum, something like, 15-20% of the state's revenues. The government can take matters into its own hands, give the East India Company the £1.5 million loan that they're asking for, but in exchange for that loan, they impose sweeping reforms on the East India Company.
But the company also needed the tea trade to be liberated, released from the taxes that made their tea too expensive, and upset the colonies.
In the early months of 1773, the East India Company asks Lord North's government to remove all of the duties on tea. Lord North's essentially offering the East India Company a rebate on the customs duties of importing the tea in the first place.
And the pitch to the British government is then, we need to pay back this enormous loan, remove this tax, and we'll just start selling tons of tea in North America. It's a big new market for us.
Exactly. It bails out the East India Company in a way, and it helps them out of the very short-term problem of not having enough cash to pay their immediate creditors, but also creates a potentially long-term market for their goods in tea.
So they've got loads of tea, and they just need to sell it to Americans who want to drink it.
The American market for tea is quite big. Benjamin Franklin says it's upwards of £500,000, which he calculates would have been able to save the East India Company from their financial problems at the time.
The answer was the British government's Tea Act, aimed at boosting East India Company income by cutting out the need to use London middlemen and enabling imports direct to North America, albeit still with a small tax. It seemed a genius solution.
This is three-dimensional chess. So Lord North thinks he's solved the problem of the East India Company collapsing. He's solved the problem of raising revenue in North America, all in one beautiful piece of legislation.
I think so, but he feels like he's got a masterstroke here, solving two imperial problems with one piece of legislation. And it turns out it's too good to be true. And actually, he was warned about it at the time.
Oh, really?
Other MPs that are more closely attuned to the tea trade and the East India Company's affairs, and with American opinion, saying this is not good enough. The Americans aren't going to take the tea as long as it's got the duty on it. They'd maintained the tea duty alone as a kind of a token measure to prove that the British Parliament still had the sovereign right to tax the American colonies.
Do you think he could believe this would be the starting gun for American Revolution?
Absolutely not. Parliament debated the Tea Act in 1773 for one day.
Little did they realise that much more attention was being paid by Americans on both sides of the Atlantic to what was going on in London.
As the Tea Act is passing through the British Parliament, Benjamin Franklin is updating all his contacts in North America with exactly what's going on. He writes here at the beginning of June 1773 to Thomas Cushing, who was the Speaker of the Massachusetts Assembly, very important figure, bringing him up to speed on what's going on. And he says, "But now the wise scheme is to take off so much duty here as will make tea cheaper in America than foreigners can supply us, and continue the duty there to keep up the exercise of the right." So the British government are removing just enough of the tax to make sure that when that tea arrives in America, it'll be cheaper than the tea provided by smugglers. But they're leaving the duty on, the tea tax in America, just so they can reinforce that idea that the British government have the right to tax the American colonies. And Franklin gives the impression that the government here are sort of patting themselves on the back. They think they've scored a bit of a win. They have no idea that any people can act from any other principle but that of interest. And they believe that 3 pence in a pound of tea, of which one does not drink 10 in a year, is sufficient to overcome all the patriotism of an American. To me, it suggests that Franklin believed that the British handling of its North American colonies had by this point been reduced to a farce.
As the summer of 1773 turned to fall, consignments of East India Company tea began their journey across the Atlantic, bound for New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Boston.
The tension really ratcheted up in late November when a ship sailed here into Boston Harbour. It was the Dartmouth out from London, and in its hull was a cargo of East India Company tea. This is no longer hypothetical. The tea was arriving in the city. Government regulation stipulated that the merchant now had 20 days to unload the tea and pay the duty. After that point, the government would take matters into its own hands. It would confiscate the cargo and distribute it itself. So the people of Boston had a choice. Would they allow that tea to be landed? Would they allow the hated duty to be paid? The timer ran out on the 17th of December. The clock was ticking.
In the State House, Thomas Hutchinson was now governor of Massachusetts. He was determined the tea would be landed and the duty paid. One by one, the ships docked at Griffin's Wharf in Boston. The Dartmouth was joined by the Eleanor and the Beaver. Replicas of two of those ships are at the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum. Visiting them brings home the complexity of the situation, faced not just by British authorities, but by the local crews and ship owners too.
A really interesting thing that strikes me about coming on board this replica ship in Boston Harbour is the extent to which this was an American setup, made of New England pine, built here in America, crewed by Americans, owned by an American. They'd gone to London to pick up a cargo, as so many American ships had done before. Just over 100 chests of tea had been stored down there in the hold, and yet, because of that, when they sailed back into Boston Harbour, they found themselves at the very centre of a massive political storm. The community divided. Their decision now, the simple decision whether to keep the tea on board or unload it, would now define them for the rest of their lives. Would they be patriots or traitors, or both at the same time?
And as they waited to find out if they could unload the tea in their holds, debate in the city intensified. It began in Faneuil Hall, the commercial heart of the city, but outgrew that location and moved to the biggest place in town, the Old South Meeting Hall. Sandwiched between the two was the State House, the symbolic base of Governor Hutchinson, who was trying to enforce the duties imposed by Britain. Discussions intensified as decision day arrived, December the 16th, 1773.
So while that tea is sitting in the hull just down there, you can almost see it through the window, what do you think the mood was in this room?
So inside this room, it's not clear what is going to happen, but it's kind of clear we've lost control of something. The real power now has devolved to this town meeting and to these 5,000 people down the street who are going to decide what to do. And Hutchinson keeps hoping someone will, this is a lonely chair to sit in here because your nearest support is 3,000 miles away. You can call for troops, but that has ended very badly the last time that has happened. And Hutchinson is more and more isolated. And he sends the sheriff, Stephen Greenleaf, to one of these meetings to declare this is an illegal gathering. So the sheriff goes in, reads his thing, this is an illegal gathering, and 5,000 people hiss. I don't know if you've ever had 5,000 people hiss at you, but Greenleaf is a guy fairly easily intimidated, and that's enough. Well, I'm not going to go try to break up another of these meetings.
Officials, merchants and ship owners moved between the governor, Hutchinson, and the gathering crowds of Bostonians here in the Old South Meeting House.
This was the largest enclosed space in Boston at the time, so it's not surprising that as the protests grew, the meetings ended up being held in here. And that December day, it said that thousands of people packed into the buildings or watched from the streets outside through the windows. And they listened to speeches, they voted in resolutions, they doubled down on their determination that that tea would not be landed and the hated tax would not be paid. There were a few voices of moderation, for example, Josiah Quincy, who warned that if the crowd took direct action, it would plunge this country into the most trying and terrible war it had yet seen. But they seemed to ignore that warning because, as well as the big public meetings, there were private, guarded conversations here. Plans were being laid for direct action that would make that conflict an inevitability.
To get a sense of the mood in this space that day, I'm meeting some of the experts who work here.
I think it would have been very tense. There are people on both sides of the faction. I remember hearing this great quote about tension crackling within the air in Boston, not just in the Old South Meeting House, but on the entire peninsula.
I think the colonists really need to figure out what they wanted to do. And I think, in my professional opinion, everybody's kind of all over the place and how they felt about the Tea Act, the provisions of the tea, the conflict around representation, and people really felt like they needed to be present and have their voices heard.
Set the scene in here on that December day.
5,000 people reportedly in this building, back to back, shoulder to shoulder, eagerly awaiting those to come up to the pulpit to give their opinions about the Tea Act and the tea being here in Boston.
All the options were aired, but it boils down to two. Either the tea has to leave town on the ships that brought it, or be destroyed.
People are warning that this is something that Bostonians can't turn back from if they do destroy property like this. Property destruction is a cardinal sin within the colonial community, so they really don't want it to come to that.
Isn't that interesting?
And there's some surprising evidence that property other than tea is highly respected.
It's an interesting story that also connects the Old South meeting house with the ships that brought the tea that ended up in Boston Harbor. It doesn't have anything to do with the huge public meeting here. Instead, it revolves around the person of an enslaved African woman. She was called Phyllis Wheatley. She'd have been allowed to sit up there with other people of color during the religious services. And she became the first published African-American author and poet. This is a copy of her book.
The first edition of this book was printed in London in 1773 and shipped to Boston.
By extraordinary coincidence, it arrived in Boston, carried in the same ship that was carrying all that notorious tea in 1773. Now, there was no tax on books, so the patriots were perfectly happy for things like books to be offloaded and sold. It was the tea they had the problem with.
And Governor Hutchinson was adamant that the ships could not leave Boston with the tea still on board. British warships were ready to stop that. It was a total impasse. Eventually, a man associated with the Sons of Liberty since the 1760s drew the Old South meeting to a dramatic close.
Late that evening, Sam Adams climbed up into the pulpit and addressed the crowd. He drew the meeting to a close, announcing, "There is nothing more this meeting can do to save the country." The message was clear. The time for talking was over. It was time for action.
Hundreds of people reportedly poured out of the meeting house's south door and were joined by others as they headed down Milk Street towards Griffin's Wharf. Some disguised themselves as indigenous Americans. Today, actors daily recreate what happened next, albeit not under cover of darkness.
So over 50 men boarded each of the three ships. There was no struggle, no resistance. I think they looked pretty determined. The captain of this vessel was actually a Quaker, he was a pacifist, so he decided to stay in his cabin and let events take their course. Probably very sensible. When it came to throwing the tea overboard, the tea was wrapped in canvas, like a waterproof cover. Inside that, there were wooden chests of different sizes. Some chests they could just pour over the side. Some were really heavy. They had to manhandle them up, 2 or 3 blokes, break open the lid, and then use shoes or hats or hands to toss some of the tea leaves over before they could pick the rest of it up and dump them in the harbour. It was low tide, and so mounds of tea started appearing, sticking out of the water, just landing on the mud of the harbour floor. And so they sent boys over the side with rakes to make sure that every single tea leaf was thoroughly immersed in the water. The tea was destroyed by men and boys, but there were women present that day. There was perhaps 1,000 onlookers on the quayside. Many of them would have been daughters and wives of the Sons of Liberty. What part do you guys play?
I am Mercy Scalay. Miss Mercy Scalay. She is the daughter of town selectman John Scalay. From letters that I found on Mercy Scalay, is a very passionate patriot. She's very interested in politics and furthering Boston as a colony to become independent from England.
So she was probably here that night?
I think so. I think she was on the sidelines cheering on all her friends.
How about you guys? What are you? Let's start.
Sure. So I'm Mr. Joseph Pierce Palmer. He's a young, very spirited, very invested in the goings-on of the efforts to increase liberty within the colonies. So he would have been here this night, either up above decks working to destroy the chest of tea or a lookout on the wharf itself. And so he's here in Boston, really working a lot of various trades that come over from England, imported goods.
So you're doing a bit of smuggling?
He is a very honorable man who would probably smuggle as much as any other merchant.
John Bell is a historian of Revolutionary-era Boston.
This is Boston Harbor. We're on the waterfront. The waterfront is considerably closer to Britain than it was in 1773 because there's been a lot of landfill.
Well, you can see this. It's all built on over the water here, yeah. So somewhere over here was where the Tea Party took
Somewhere
place.
inland,
Okay.
At least 2 or 3 blocks inland,
Wow, that
was
far, yeah.
where Griffin's Wharf was, and that was where the 3 ships carrying East India Company tea were ordered to stay and not be unloaded until December 1773.
And this water would have been stained brown with the tea.
Yes.
And who's providing the muscle? Who are the enforcers? Who are going around enforcing the boycott, or indeed splitting open those chests and dumping tea in the sea?
Well, we remember names like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, but the man who was most involved in the actual physical action was probably the merchant William Molyneux. And we don't remember him at all because he died in October 1774 before the war, and he was never part of the Revolutionary War or the founding of the new government. He is the one leader among the very top Boston Whigs who was not in Old South Meeting House while the tea was actually being destroyed. The rest of them, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Dr. Joseph Warren, Dr. Thomas Young, and so on, they were all sitting in Old South Meeting House in view of hundreds of people when the crime was taking place. William Molyneux was not there.
So they've got an alibi.
Exactly. And the people who are carrying it out were more likely from the working class, the craftsmen, waterfront workers themselves, blacksmiths, because there were very big chests of tea, hundreds of pounds of tea that had to be hauled up from the ship's cargo, chopped open, and then dumped overboard.
And who are these radicals? It's one of the most celebrated events in American history. Do we know exactly what went down and who was there?
Well, it was one of the most celebrated events. It was also a criminal act, and you don't write down things about the criminal conspiracy. There was a list of men kept by the printer Benjamin Eads. They signed themselves to secrecy, and then in subsequent years, that list was destroyed.
It sounds like it was efficient, it was quiet, it was very deliberate.
It was an extremely controlled event because they wanted to make very clear that they only wanted to destroy the tea. There was a lock on one of the ships that had to be broken in order to get to the cargo, and the next day, somebody went and gave that ship's captain a lock to replace the broken one. And then they put that in the newspaper to make it clear to the world that no property except the East India Company tea had been destroyed.
News of the destruction of the tea in Boston reached London in January 1774. The reaction was one of near universal horror. Lord North declared, "The Americans have tarred and feathered your subjects, burnt your ships, denied obedience to your laws and authority. Yet so clement and so forbearing has our conduct been, that it is incumbent on us now to take a different course. It goes to all. We must control them or submit to them." The port of Boston was shut down, and a host of oppressive measures, known as the Intolerable Acts, were applied as punishment and to restore British authority. They succeeded in achieving the very opposite.
Benjamin Franklin travelled back to America in 1775 as relations grew ever worse. And there's a fascinating unsent letter which he dashed off to a former friend, colleague, ally, William Strahan, that I think articulates the very real pain that people were feeling at this time of growing separation. He writes, "You are a member of Parliament and one of that majority which has doomed my country to destruction. You have begun to burn our towns and murder our people. Look upon your hands, they are stained with the blood of your relations. You and I were long friends. You are now my enemy, and I am yours. Be friends."
Less than a year after, the Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia. Its first public reading in Massachusetts was made, without a hint of irony of course, from the balcony of the old State House.
We always like to say Bostonians did the legwork and Philadelphians did the paperwork. So I think there's kind of this pride about us starting the American Revolution.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.